After Braun Breaker was sent to the hospital, a chilling question began to echo through Monday Night Raw. Is Seth Rollins orchestrating the systematic destruction of every member of Vision? That possibility hangs heavy as the chaos unfolds. Adam Pearce is confronted backstage by Paul Heyman, who places the blame for Braun Breaker's devastating injury squarely on the general manager's shoulders. According to Heyman, Pearce's handling of the situation pushed Breaker into such fury that he overexerted himself in training, suffering a hernia that now requires major surgery, an injury that could threaten his entire career. Pearce stands firm, reminding Heyman that he runs Raw and understands Breaker's value. But what's done is done. His focus now is the Elimination Chamber. Austin Theory has been inserted into the qualifying match, and Pearce makes one thing clear. No member of Vision will be allowed anywhere near it. The backstage corridors of Monday Night Raw felt different tonight. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the usual pre-show jitters and competitive energy. Something darker had taken root in WWE, something that was systematically tearing apart one of the most dominant factions in recent memory. Vision, the group that had seemed unstoppable just weeks ago, was now bleeding members, watching helplessly as their numbers dwindled and their power eroded. And at the center of all this chaos stood one name that kept emerging from the shadows, one face that seemed connected to every attack, every ambush, every carefully orchestrated piece of destruction. Seth Rollins, the visionary, the architect, and possibly the masked man who had been terrorizing Vision from the shadows. Braun Breaker had been the latest victim, the powerhouse who had seemed invincible, the monster who had bulldozed through opponent after opponent with terrifying ease, was now lying in a hospital bed, his career hanging in the balance. The official story was that he had suffered a severe hernia during an intense training session, an injury so serious that it required immediate surgery and months of recovery time. But whispers echoed through the locker room telling a different story entirely. People spoke in hushed tones about Breaker's state of mind in recent weeks, about how he had been pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond his control, about how he had trained himself into the ground trying to prove something to someone. And many of those whispers pointed back to one source of that psychological pressure: the systematic targeting of Vision by unknown forces. The connection was impossible to ignore. Over the past several weeks, every member of Vision had been attacked, humiliated, or injured in increasingly brutal fashion. What had started as isolated incidents now revealed itself as a coordinated campaign, a strategic dismantling of the faction piece by piece. First it was Austin Theory, blindsided during a promo and left gasping in the ring. Then it was another member, ambushed backstage and left battered against equipment crates. Each attack bore the same hallmarks: precise timing, overwhelming force, and most disturbingly, the presence of a masked figure who moved through WWE's backstage area like a ghost, striking without warning and disappearing before security could respond. The masked man had become the subject of intense speculation throughout the WWE universe. Grainy footage from security cameras showed a figure in black tactical gear, face obscured by a mask that revealed nothing except cold, calculating eyes. The build was familiar to wrestling fans, the movement patterns recognizable to those who had studied the sport for years. But without concrete evidence, without a clear reveal, the identity remained frustratingly out of reach. Theories ranged from returning legends to disgruntled former allies, from hired mercenaries to rival faction members. But one name kept surfacing more than any other in these discussions: Seth Rollins. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling. Rollins had already publicly revealed himself as Austin Theory's attacker, demonstrating both the willingness and ability to strike at Vision. His skills as a tactician were legendary, his nickname the Architect earned through years of carefully planned attacks and strategic brilliance. He had the motivation, viewing Vision as representatives of everything wrong with modern WWE, entitled upstarts who hadn't earned their positions. And he certainly had the physical capability, his in-ring prowess and athletic ability making him more than capable of the devastating attacks that had been occurring. But Rollins had denied being the masked man in interviews and backstage confrontations. He took credit for the attack on Theory gladly, even proudly, but insisted that whatever else was happening to Vision had nothing to do with him. This denial only made things more confusing and the mystery deeper. Was Rollins telling the truth? Was someone else targeting Vision independently? Or was this all part of some elaborate mind game, with the Visionary playing chess while everyone else played checkers? The atmosphere backstage on this particular night was electric with anticipation and dread. Braun Breaker's injury had sent shockwaves through the roster, and now everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next, who would be targeted, whether the attacks would continue or if they had finally run their course. The members of Vision who remained active were on high alert, traveling in groups, watching their backs, refusing to be caught vulnerable like their fallen brothers. But paranoia had set in, and paranoia can be just as destructive as any physical attack. Adam Pearce, Raw's general manager, was under immense pressure. The attacks had occurred on his watch, under his authority, and questions were being asked about his ability to maintain order and protect the superstars under his care. He had increased security measures, installed additional cameras, assigned personnel to watch over vulnerable areas. But somehow the attacks continued, the masked man remaining one step ahead, exploiting weaknesses and finding opportunities that shouldn't have existed. Pearce's frustration was visible in every interaction, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the weight of responsibility and criticism. Then Paul Heyman arrived. The Wiseman, still bearing the physical marks of his own recent brutal encounter with Triple H, stormed through the backstage area with singular purpose. His destination was clear: Adam Pearce's office, and he was not coming for a friendly conversation. Cameras followed Heyman as he moved through the corridors, his face a mask of controlled fury, his body language radiating righteous indignation. Whatever he had to say to the general manager, it was going to be explosive. Heyman burst into Pearce's office without knocking, without announcement, without any of the usual professional courtesies. Pearce looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to resignation as he recognized his visitor. Before the general manager could even open his mouth to speak, Heyman launched into a verbal assault that was vintage Wiseman. Every word carefully chosen for maximum impact, every sentence building toward a devastating conclusion. Paul Heyman's voice filled the office and spilled out into the hallway where cameras and personnel had gathered to witness the confrontation. He spoke about responsibility, about duty, about the sacred trust between management and talent that had been violated and shattered. And then he got specific. He placed the blame for Braun Breaker's devastating injury directly and unequivocally on Adam Pearce's shoulders. According to Heyman's impassioned argument, it was Pearce's mishandling of the situation with Vision, his failure to protect them from the masked attacker, his inability to maintain basic order and safety that had created the environment where Breaker felt he had no choice but to push himself beyond his limits. The Wiseman painted a vivid picture of Braun Breaker's mindset in recent weeks. He described a man consumed by fury and frustration, a powerhouse rendered impotent by circumstances beyond his control, a fighter who couldn't fight back against an enemy he couldn't identify or locate. Pearce's failures had pushed Breaker into a corner, and when a man like Braun Breaker gets cornered, he lashes out the only way he knows how, through physical intensity and overwhelming force. So Breaker had gone to the gym and trained like a madman, pushing his body past its breaking point, trying to prepare for a threat he couldn't define, trying to work out his rage on equipment and weights because he couldn't direct it at his true enemies. And that's when it happened. During an especially intense training session, pushing himself harder than he should have, Breaker felt something tear inside. The pain was immediate and excruciating, dropping the monster to his knees and leaving him gasping for air. Medical personnel had rushed to his aid, and the diagnosis was severe. A major hernia that required immediate surgical intervention. The kind of injury that could end careers if not properly treated, the kind of setback that might take months or even years to fully recover from. And according to Paul Heyman, that injury and all its implications were Adam Pearce's fault. Heyman didn't stop there. He expanded his criticism to encompass Pearce's entire tenure as general manager, questioning his competence, his judgment, his fitness for the role. The attacks on Vision had been occurring for weeks, and what had Pearce done to stop them? What meaningful action had he taken to protect his roster? How many more superstars would have to be injured before Pierce admitted his failures and either fixed the situation or stepped aside for someone who could? The verbal assault was relentless and brutal, delivered with all the eloquence and rhetorical skill that had made Paul Heyman a legendary figure in professional wrestling. Every word landed like a physical blow, every accusation cut deep, every question demanded an answer that Pierce struggled to provide. The cameras captured every moment of the general manager's discomfort, every flash of anger or frustration that crossed his face, every attempt to interject that was steamrolled by Heyman's verbal onslaught. When Heyman finally paused for breath, giving Pierce an opportunity to respond, the general manager's reply was measured but firm. He acknowledged the gravity of Braun Breaker's injury and expressed genuine concern for the superstar's well-being and recovery. But he refused to accept full responsibility for what had happened. Pierce reminded Heyman that he ran Monday Night Raw, that he understood the value of every superstar on his roster, including Braun Breaker, and that he was doing everything within his power to identify and stop the masked attacker who had been terrorizing Vision. But Pierce also made it clear that dwelling on what had already happened served no purpose. What's done is done. Braun Breaker was injured and would require time to recover, and nothing could change that unfortunate reality. The general manager's focus now had to be on moving forward, on the upcoming Elimination Chamber Premium Live event, on maintaining the integrity and excitement of Monday Night Raw despite the chaos that had engulfed it in recent weeks. Then Pierce dropped a bombshell that shifted the entire conversation. Austin Theory, one of Vision's most prominent remaining members, had been inserted into a qualifying match for the Elimination Chamber. This was a huge opportunity for Theory, a chance to compete for a championship and potentially main event one of WWE's most important shows. But there were conditions attached, and Pierce made them crystal clear in his response to Heyman. No member of Vision would be allowed anywhere near that qualifying match. Not at ringside, not backstage near the entrance, nowhere that they could interfere or influence the outcome. This declaration was both protection and punishment. Pierce was attempting to create a safe environment for the match, preventing the chaos and interference that had plagued so many recent Raw segments. But he was also sending a message to Vision. Their pattern of behavior, their reputation for bending rules and using numbers advantages, would not be tolerated in this instance. Austin Theory would have to succeed or fail on his own merits, without the support system that Vision had provided their members in the past. The conversation between Heyman and Pierce could have ended there, with both men having said their piece and established their positions. But the night was far from over, and the biggest revelations were still to come. As Heyman stormed out of Pierce's office, still seething from the confrontation, the cameras followed him through the backstage area. And that's when everything changed. Seth Rollins emerged from around a corner, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the vicinity. He wasn't in his ring gear but rather in street clothes, suggesting he had arrived at the arena recently and was perhaps just beginning his night. His eyes locked onto Paul Heyman immediately, and you could see recognition flash across both men's faces. These two had history together, years of interaction both professional and personal, relationships that had evolved and changed over time as alliances shifted and circumstances changed. But the real shock came a moment later when a second figure emerged from the same direction, following slightly behind Rollins. The figure was smaller in stature, lean and dangerous looking, moving with the predatory grace of someone who had spent their entire life perfecting the art of violence. As the man stepped into better lighting, his face became clear to the cameras, and the wrestling world collectively gasped in disbelief. Jon Moxley, the Blackpool Combat Club's most dangerous member, the former WWE champion who had left the company years ago and become an icon in another promotion. What was he doing backstage at Monday Night Raw? Why was he with Seth Rollins? And most importantly, what did his presence mean for the mystery of the masked man? The implications were staggering and immediate. Moxley's build matched that of the masked attacker. His fighting style, brutal and uncompromising, aligned with the vicious nature of the attacks on Vision. His history with Seth Rollins was well documented. They had been brothers in arms during the Shield's legendary run, had understood each other's tactical approaches, had operated as a seamless unit when pursuing common goals. If anyone could recruit Jon Moxley for a mission of destruction, it would be Seth Rollins. Paul Heyman stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. The wise man's mind was clearly racing, connections forming, possibilities crystallizing into terrible certainty. He had represented both of these men at different points in their careers, knew their capabilities intimately, understood what they were capable of when working together. And now they were here, together, on Monday Night Raw, while a masked man had been systematically destroying Vision and terrorizing the roster. Seth Rollins smiled, that knowing smirk that suggested he was aware of exactly what everyone was thinking and found their dawning realization amusing. He made no move to explain Moxley's presence, offered no justification or clarification. He simply stood there, letting the moment speak for itself, letting the wrestling world draw its own conclusions about what was happening and what it meant. Jon Moxley's expression was harder to read. He looked around the backstage area with what might have been nostalgia or might have been disdain, taking in the familiar surroundings of his former employer. His eyes eventually settled on the cameras, acknowledging their presence without seeming particularly bothered by them. Moxley had never been one for elaborate explanations or lengthy promos. He let his actions speak louder than words, and his very presence backstage at Raw was an action that spoke volumes. The tension in the backstage area was suffocating. Personnel had stopped what they were doing to watch this encounter, everyone recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing. Wrestlers emerged from locker rooms, drawn by the commotion and the buzz of excitement that was rippling through the building. The atmosphere had shifted from tense anticipation to electric possibility. Something major was happening, something that could reshape the entire landscape of Monday Night Raw. Paul Heyman found his voice finally, addressing both men with a mixture of respect and caution. The wise man understood better than most what these two were capable of separately and together. He had seen the Shield dominate WWE, had witnessed the destruction they could cause when united in purpose. And while the Shield was long disbanded, the core understanding between Rollins and Moxley clearly remained intact. But before Heyman could say more than a few words, Rollins raised a hand to silence him. The gesture was casual but carried authority, and Heyman actually stopped talking, a rare occurrence for someone who had built a career on never being at a loss for words. Rollins then spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the backstage area and ensuring that everyone present heard his message. The visionary didn't confirm or deny Moxley's involvement with the masked attacks on Vision. He didn't explain why the AEW star was backstage at a WWE show. He didn't provide any of the answers that everyone desperately wanted. Instead, he spoke in vague but menacing terms about accountability, about consequences, about how actions have reactions and debts eventually come due. He talked about Vision as if they were a problem that needed solving, a cancer that needed removing, a stain on WWE that required cleansing. Jon Moxley remained silent throughout Rollins' speech, but his body language spoke clearly. He stood slightly behind and to the side of Rollins in a position that suggested support and alliance. His eyes continuously scanned the area, watching for threats, staying alert in a way that suggested combat readiness. Everything about Moxley's demeanor indicated that he wasn't just visiting an old workplace. He was here with purpose, here as part of something larger. The masked man mystery suddenly seemed much clearer while simultaneously becoming more complex. If Moxley was the person behind the mask, then everything made sense. The tactical precision, the brutal efficiency, the ability to evade capture. Moxley had spent years perfecting his craft in various promotions around the world, had developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous and unpredictable performers in professional wrestling. He could absolutely pull off the campaign of terror that had been waged against Vision. But questions remained. Why would Jon Moxley, who had seemingly burned his bridges with WWE years ago, come back to target a faction he had no obvious connection to? What did he owe Seth Rollins that would compel him to participate in such a risky venture? And perhaps most intriguingly, if WWE was bringing back Moxley even temporarily, what did that mean for the future of the company and its relationship with other promotions? The backstage encounter didn't end in violence, which somehow made it more unsettling than if punches had been thrown. Instead, Rollins and Moxley simply walked away, moving deeper into the backstage area together while leaving everyone else to process what had just occurred. Paul Heyman stood frozen, his usually active mind visible working through implications and possibilities.